There is so much going on with the Pac-12. How do we know what's going to happen? We'll talk about that and more on today's episode of Locked On Buffs.
You are Locked On Buffs, your daily podcast on the Colorado Buffaloes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? This is Locked On Buffs, your Monday episode of the podcast. Joining me today, Kevin Borba, is John Canzano, Pac-12 Insider. He's everywhere on the radio. He votes for the Heisman. He does it all. John, thank you for joining us. How you doing?
You bet. Love it, man. Love the intro. That's big time. This is great.
Little fancy with it. Yeah. Today we're talking Pac-12 expansion, media rights deals. We're going to talk about Coach Prime's effect on Colorado and the Pac-12. But before we do, this episode is brought to you by HelloFresh. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Go to HelloFresh.com/LockedOnCollege60 and use code College60 for 60% off plus free shipping. Okay, John, we have so much going on. We'll go flashback to last July. USC and UCLA announced they're leaving the Pac-12. They kind of pulled a Texas into Oklahoma, if you will, where they didn't really give any warning. It was just like as soon as the deal was basically pen to paper, we found out publicly. So they just left. So left the Pac-12 in a disarray, trying to figure out what was going to happen with their media rights deal, which expires soon, and then Pac-12 expansion. So can you kind of give us a breakdown of where the Pac-12 currently is media rights-wise? Because we keep getting, I think April 15th was the most recent tentative deadline that we kind of got. But can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, let's go. Let's start. Something you said there that was interesting to me that kind of reminded me, back in July when this all happened, I talked to the principals at UCLA and USC about their departure and how that all went down. They were surprised that it didn't get out publicly. They did a really good job in conjunction with the Big Ten of keeping their business private. And they used, third-party portals to avoid having any of it subject to freedom of information and public records laws. And, but they were surprised. UCLA and USC both said that they were a little surprised that it didn't leak, that it didn't get out, because it was a big discussion. And obviously it was a gut punch to the Pac-12 that conference is still trying to recover from. To your point, yeah, I think everybody's, sort of eagerly anticipating what is going to happen and when we'll get information. I thought, we might have something last year, right? Thanksgiving. I can remember going, hey, maybe we can get something by Thanksgiving, and maybe the conference will have something by Christmas. And then it was like, maybe they'll have something early in 2023. And here we are now. I think in March when several presidents went public, it looked orchestrated to me. You had Michael Crow at Arizona State going public with the student newspaper. You had Dr. Robert Robbins at Arizona going public with several TV stations that put cameras in front of him and other entities. And you had obviously Washington State, Kirk Schultz, and Oregon State's Jyothi Murthy, the brand new president there, all spoke about March and April like, those were deadlines, like that was where the goalpost got planted. And I think a lot of it, of the expectation and the anticipation and the disappointment, frankly, in the last couple of weeks when, now the conference is saying, hey, pump the brakes. There's no urgency to this. We'll get a deal when we get it. Like, I think the conference is guilty of creating some of that urgency by coming out and talking about March and talking about April. And maybe they felt like they were winding down and they felt like they were close and something changed. Or maybe the presidents just aren't that familiar. Like a lot of the presidents that are involved in this, that were not around when the conference negotiated its last media rights deal. And so maybe they're just not familiar with the timelines of such things. So we're now being told, hey, look, the Big Ten didn't go public with their deal until there was 11 months remaining on their existing contract. And that's, last July was the 11-month mark. And that's when they came out. And so we're at 15 months now with the Pac-12. I think, a lot of people have fatigue with this negotiation. The public is fatigued. I think the conference may be fatigued. Maybe the partners they're talking with are fatigued as well. I don't know. But I know from a media standpoint, I want to be talking about football. I want to be talking about the 5 teams that are likely to be ranked and Coach Prime and Colorado in that spring game and look at the quarterbacks in this conference. And instead, this continues to move like a cloud over the conference. They have to get this settled. Now I'm looking at May and June and going, okay, we can't get to July, can we, without this having some resolution?
Yeah, I feel like you say we can't get to July, but I feel like knowing how it's just gone, we probably could get to July.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's just the trends. A couple things that I've taken away from this whole process is one, I think, and this is just like speculating, like back when the Big 12 hadn't had a deal yet, there could have been like a little arms race competition to see who could get it first. And now the Pac 12 is kind of their last. And so it's a weird position to be in because obviously everybody's looking at you and waiting for you to fail and kind of like poach whoever, like the four corner schools. And then the two Northwest, Oregon and Washington State, have been linked to the Big 10 and stuff like that. But I think the Pac 12 finds themselves in between a rock and a hard place because it's like we're the last ones, but it's also we're the only ones going right now. So we have all of this time. So I feel like they're trying to take their time to kind of ensure that they get the deal that they best can achieve.
Yeah, I understand that. And I think, we all have to step back a little bit because, the Big 12 went to market early and they just renegotiated with their existing partners. Now, I know at the time the narrative was, oh, they left money on the table. And, I talked to Brett Yormark, the Big 12 commissioner, about that. I asked him that. Do you feel like you left money on the table? And I think there was an advantage from the Big 12 standpoint to get the stability that they wanted. They wanted everybody locked down. They wanted stability. And I think, if they traded a few dollars for that, then good on them for doing it. The Pac-12 subsequently spun that into, hey, we won't be competing against any other Power 5 conference. We're going to be the only one that has media rights up for bid. And, they saw that as an advantageous position. They're also negotiating with some new partners. I think it's no secret that they're looking hard at streaming services, Apple and Amazon, potentially either or both at the table. They haven't done deals with college conferences before. Apple is brand new with MLS and Major League Baseball, and they appear to be doing a good job there. But I talked to principals who negotiated those deals, and they said, yeah, it moves slower than negotiating with an ESPN or Fox, who normally is in that space. So keep in mind that may be part of this hang up. It also may just be that the Pac-12 doesn't feel that the timeline that the rest of us have set publicly works for them. And, they're under, maybe they have a different clock in their mind and they say, look, we need to get every dollar possible. Or maybe being, on ESPN or Amazon and Apple, maybe they wanted to take one last look around before they sign a deal. But, for the rest of us, it's exhausting, I think, and fans are ready to move on from it. And I don't think the conference has done a very good job with the PR part of this. I think that has been a major misfire. Like if I look at what the Big 12 has done from a public relations standpoint. They are smart in how they're positioning. Even if they left money on the table, they're really smart in how they positioned that. Hey, look, we went to market earlier. We leapfrogged the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 presidents and chancellors may not agree with that depiction, but that narrative is being told in an effective way by the Big 12. And so I think it has created a cloud over the Pac-12 that maybe some of the Pac-12 members don't think is accurate or real, but it's out there and that perception is reality. And so I think the PR part of this, the Pac-12, I would give them a grade of like a D- on their PR handling of this whole thing. They were too quiet in the beginning. They, didn't establish where the goalposts were. They looked reactive. And, I think some of it probably relates to the idea that you have presidents and chancellors, you have the world of academia. It's not the real world. Like anybody who's worked on a campus or walked across a campus knows that it's a different planet sometimes on those campuses. And I think sometimes the presidents and chancellors and what they value, it's foreign to the rest of us.
Yeah, and I like the word that you threw out there because the Pac-12 has been very reactive. That's kind of been something I've said the whole entire time. It's like they throw out responses to everything, but they never have they never have an offensive statement to make. It's always like, well, actually, we're going to do this because, or we're going to focus on this because. And so they have been very reactive. And before we move on, grand slams, no hitters, and double plays are back. And there's no better place to get in on MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to fanduel.com/lockedon and place your first bet and go up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. If you don't win, you get your money back. So don't miss your chance to get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Let's go to fanduel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of the MLB. Okay, I said we were going to talk media rights and expansion. Media rights, and you threw out the players a little bit, Apple, Amazon. We knew ESPN was a player all along because they have the patent Pac-12 After Dark time slot will be always open for someone because obviously, as someone who's lived on the East Coast for a year and then moved back to the West Coast, I know there's not much going on at 10:30 on the East Coast television wise. But I wanted to touch on expansion, and I feel like this is probably one. It's probably one of the more interesting parts of this, and two, maybe one of the more toxic parts of this when you're trying to cover it. I just feel like on social media it gets very intense when you bring up expansion and Pac-12 media rights stuff. So I'm just going to give you a team, and I'd like to give you like a letter grade of like where they would stand with the Pac-12. So San Diego State and SMU will obviously be A's or A pluses, I would assume.
Yeah, I would take San Diego State. I think is in front of SMU in my mind.
Okay.
If you're the Pac-12, getting back into Southern California, even 1 foot in, even in San Diego County, it's not LA, but it's San Diego County. Getting 1 foot back in opens doors to sponsorships that are Southern California based. I know the 76 gas stations. They're one of the prime tentpole sponsors of the Pac-12 basketball tournaments. And their most important markets are in Southern California. So it's not just TV ratings, it's potential corporate sponsors as well. I think San Diego State brings that in a way that nobody else does. And it helps replace part of the divot left by the 5.7 million television households that you lost when UCLA and USC left. So you get about 1.13 million approximately households in San Diego County. You get the ability to recruit Southern California. But let's look at what San Diego State has done. Academically, they stepped it up. You can get a PhD now on that campus. They have, worked with consultants and invested in their academics. They built Snapdragon Stadium. They have positioned themselves in such a way that when their basketball program gets to the Final Four and makes the title game, it's just seen as gravy. And so I think San Diego State feels like a no-brainer to me. And they are the only no-brainer that I see on the board. And so I'm going to put them as an A. I would put SMU maybe as a B plus. I'm a harder grader, but okay. I think SMU makes a lot of sense. But SMU comes with some questions if you're a Pac-12 president or chancellor. So SMU gets you into Dallas-Fort Worth, all right? So now we're talking north of 3.5 million TV households. I've talked to the TV executives. Of course, ratings matter, but they care more about television households. That's what truly measures when it comes to expansion. That's what drives expansion. That's why the Big Ten was after Rutgers and it was after Maryland. It wanted New York City and it wanted Washington, D.C. The Rutgers and Maryland, they don't rate in those markets, but they needed those television households. So Dallas-Fort Worth is interesting for that reason. It's also growing. I've heard people in Dallas talk about DFW being growing to maybe be the number 3 media market in the country in 5 to 10 years. So there's a growth element there that is interesting. Academics, SMU qualifies, checks some boxes there. It is a private school. It is smaller in footprint. I think there may be some questions for SMU about that, but I think they're highly motivated. I think you have some donors at SMU that would be willing to subsidize their entry into the Pac-12. So that may get the attention of some of the Pac-12 members who aren't looking forward to, some of the reductions and deficit that they'll be operating at versus maybe the Big Ten or SEC when it comes to that media rights number that they ultimately get. So, SMU makes sense if you want to get into Texas, you want to recruit Texas. Like if I'm Colorado and I'm on Coach Prime, I really want to recruit Texas. That matters to me. Having SMU in the fold is attractive. So I think SMU is in that second position in my mind, but I'm going to put them at a B plus. I won't go into an A category because I do think it's a leap when you talk about the academics in the Pac-12 and the presidents and chancellors opening their minds to taking a school from Texas. Now you're starting to creep east, and that's not where their minds have traditionally been. And so that's what, in my mind, keeps it from being an A is just the geography of it. Are you asking too much of Washington and Washington State to make that trip? Do they have? Is it going to be tough on your other sports programs? I do think the Pac-12 thinks differently than the Big Ten or the SEC, and that could be a whole nother show. But so I think that's really what keeps it from being an A in my mind. But if I'm an SMU fan, I'm looking at this going, hey, we're in pretty good position. Kliavkoff made the visit. I know that the president at SMU and the athletic director and all the staff there have been told not to talk to media, not to discuss this stuff. I think it means that the Pac-12 is probably serious about him. And so I do know that they are one of the 4 schools that the Pac-12 has seriously looked at. And so for that reason, I think if you're an SMU fan, you have reason to be hopeful here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the options that are out there right now, or at least the names that are being floated around, I think it kind of, especially with geography, kind of being going out the window with USC and UCLA going to their closest conference game being Nebraska. I think the Pac-12 would be maybe take a step back and go back to divisions, or at least consider it if they do have to go east. And so that way Colorado and Arizona's are playing the schools that are in Texas or wherever else. Because I'm going to allude to my next school here. So obviously we have San Diego State, SMU. Colorado State was a surprising one for me. You reported that, and they have the Rocky Mountain rivalry. They're in the Denver market, and they have everything that I guess the Pac-12 kind of already has. So geography sense, they make sense. The school that I'm more interested in, though, just because I don't think people realize, one, how academically inclined they were. Two, they kind of got competitive at the right time. Tulane, which is obviously in New Orleans, Louisiana. You said obviously going east bumped the grade down a little bit, so I'm afraid to see the Tulane grade now. But what do you think about Tulane?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, and I think I think a lot of people were watching as Tulane played USC in that bowl game and going, okay, competitively, where do they fit? Like, and they look like they belong on the field, right? And so, I think academically it fits. I think the geography is the big question. Now, if the Pac-12 is willing to open its mind and say, look, we want to get into other time zones, we want to get into other recruiting areas, Tulane would have to be on that list, and it would also create a travel partner for SMU that isn't outrageous, because that's a big problem when you look at it. But, I have been told by people far smarter than me that, what drive expansion are no-brainer decisions. So the question I would throw back at you and viewers and listeners of this is Tulane a no-brainer? And I don't think it's a no-brainer, but I think it, I don't know that they're one of the four schools that the Pac-12 looked at. I don't have that confirmed. I certainly would poke around it, because frankly, because of the fertile recruiting footprint there. And I think if you are Colorado, Utah, Oregon, you'd love to get into SEC territory and start recruiting, and be in Texas and be in Louisiana. So I think for that reason, you'd look at it, but it's not the craziest thing that has been talked about. But again, it comes back to, will these lifelong academics that run these universities open their minds enough to go, hey, we need to go east? And I think, the Big 12 was super reactive after Texas and Oklahoma left. And when they went and got Cincinnati and Central Florida and BYU and Houston, I looked at that and went, okay, I like BYU. It makes sense to me. I like Houston. You get the Houston TV market. I wasn't as big or wild about Cincinnati and Central Florida, but I understand the strategy was, it was about getting into other time zones and creating more value for your media package. And so does Tulane bring media value package? A little bit. It mostly brings a travel partner, some academics, and it opens the door to recruit that portion of the country.
Yeah, and I think especially with the Big 12, they kind of, and I know a lot of it is based on academics, TV households and stuff, but they also happen to get UCF and Cincinnati at like a very good time as well, because those two programs in the American are probably one of the more trendy group of five programs. They kind of reminded me of Boise State in those early years with like Kellen Moore and all those guys, where it was just like Boise State was always the team next in waiting. So they thought, but now it looks like they will continue to be the face of the Mountain West unless the Big 12 shoots them an invite. The final couple teams I wanted to discuss, Rice, I feel like academically, sure. Market-wise, they're in Houston, so they have that. But then they go on the field, on the court, and Rice isn't very competitive in many things. So that's tough. And then do you think that the Pac-12 will ever consider just not a one-sport member, but a non-football member, like a Gonzaga? I threw out UConn the other day after a late night out on Austin, so that was a fun thought process. But do you think they would ever consider just a main sport contributor?
Yeah, I think Rice would get some consideration because of the Houston TV market. Again, this is about television households, not necessarily your performance on the field. Mm-hmm. And that's why the UCF and the Cincinnati thing fall a little flat for me. And, look, I think UCF has had some great, performances, and Cincinnati trendy, obviously, playoff contender in a outlier year. It's great. But I'm just not blown away by the television market and the TV households. And So I think I'd look at Rice if I were the Pac-12. I don't know if it moves the needle, but it does accomplish the travel partner for SMU if you want to stay balanced in that way. Beyond that, you look at Boise State, you look at those others. I just think Boise State doesn't work for the Pac-12 because you've got some Pac-12 schools that I think would veto it because they view Boise State as a recruiting competitor in their own region. And Boise only has 517,000 TV households. If Boise were in LA, the Big Ten would have taken them. That's the logic. That's why I think it was really interesting when this all first broke that people, myself included, had a hard time grasping, what was happening with the landscape of college athletics. But it was driven by TV households and football. So back to your second part of your question, would the Pac-12 ever consider a non-football basketball only member like Gonzaga or somebody like that? And I think they would look at it, but I don't think that there's enough value there. And I know Gonzaga's hired a consultant who is busy working behind the scenes to show data that shows, hey, how undervalued basketball is. And, I get it. I think men's basketball in particular, there's some upside there. There's soon to be upside in women's basketball. We saw a great tournament and some value there, but TV contracts are driven by football, 80% football. And so for that reason, unless Gonzaga is willing to come into the Pac-12 conference at a 20% distribution, I don't think they're going to be interested in taking Gonzaga. I also think you might get some pushback from some of the conference members who are good in basketball, who go, hey, we don't want to recruit against Gonzaga, and in particular Washington and Washington State looking over their shoulder in that part of the country. But if I'm the Pac-12, I would look at it, I would explore it. From my vantage point, I think Gonzaga's kicking the tires, looking around, trying to figure out where it fits. I don't know how serious they are about actually leaving the WCC. If I were them, they have a great situation there. Even in a down year, they're like a 4 seed nowadays. They capture a larger percentage of their NCAA tournament units than others. They have their own TV deal. They're living a pretty blessed life in the WCC. So I don't think they would leave unless it was a no-brainer. Again, we're back to no-brainer decisions. That's what drives expansion. It's football, it's TV, and it's no-brainer decisions. So ask yourself those 3 things whenever you're looking at any possible candidate. Is it a no-brainer?
Yeah, and that's usually the issue I find, because I guess I was never thinking no-brainer, but just more so how much it made sense. And so there's a lot of programs where it's would it be academically and football-wise a fit? Yes. Does it make sense for them to travel to Texas or USF, for example, in Florida, way out there, way east, as far as east as it gets? But they're an academic school. They have the Tampa market, which I don't know how big it is, but it's a decent sized market, I would imagine. But then it's who's going to travel with them? And then you got to find another. There's just so much going on. But what is not going on, and we'll have to move a little quicker these last 2 topics so I can get you out of here on time. Colorado has been extremely quiet this entire time. We've seen 3/4 of the 4 corner schools, like you mentioned earlier, come out and make statements basically pledging their allegiance to the Pac-12. Whereas Colorado actually reported today by the New York Post is again kind of emerging as a candidate, which the reports are interesting because they've always been a candidate for the Big 12. So I don't know if they thought that was something different, but they are again being linked to the Big 12 and they've been quiet. So what are your thoughts on the quietness in Boulder?
Yeah, well, look, I think every school should be exploring what's best for themselves. They should at least be looking at it. I think the schools would be lying if they told you they weren't at least talking and thinking in those terms. Several of them have hired consulting firms that I've talked with, and part of the mission of those consulting firms is just to sort of report back to the schools and say, here's where you fit, here's what we think your value is. And so I think it goes for Oregon, it goes for Washington, it goes for Colorado, Utah, everybody. They should at least be thinking in those terms. But ask yourself, Colorado was in the Big 12. It was a better conference when they were in it. Texas and Oklahoma were part of it. The world was better when they were in it. They saw the horizon, they saw what was happening, and they left for the Pac-12. Now, I think that they have to obviously think, hey, what happens if Oregon or Washington leave for the Big Ten someday? Where do we go? What happens if we don't get a TV deal? They have to be considering all those things, along with Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah, everybody. But ultimately, what I think is happening here is, I think, the Pac-12, the sources I'm talking with, they're people who are in the room, and I've talked to executives and administrators and ADs. I've talked to sources at every Pac-12 school, not just the 10 that are remaining, all 12 schools. I talk with them. The feedback I'm consistently getting, particularly from people who are in the room, part of the CEO group, is that they are confident that they're either going to beat the $31.6 million annual distribution that the Big 12 members got or be within range of it. Now, if that happens, nobody's leaving. Like nobody, you wouldn't make that move for lateral dollars or even a couple $1 million more. You wouldn't make that move. So I think what we're seeing is I think we're probably seeing some contingency planning, maybe some discussions internally. Certainly if I'm the Big 12, I would be hoping and wishing and rubbing my hands together, hoping that, one of those schools is going to break free and you'd have a chance to bring them in because, having Colorado, having Utah, Arizona State, far better than the schools that have been added in expansion to the Big 12. Like maybe with the exception of BYU, far better. Like I think those are better candidates. So yeah, of course, a destabilized Pac-12 would be interesting to the Big 12, but I don't see it happening. I don't think Colorado's leaving. I don't think Utah's leaving. I don't think Arizona or Arizona State are leaving. I think they're all doing their diligence, just like Oregon and Washington and Oregon State and Cal and Stanford. Everybody's doing their diligence, but the feedback has been consistent, including sources at Colorado who have told me they want to be in the Pac-12. That's where they feel like they're going to be. And even Rick George, the athletic director at Colorado, on the podcast that I do with John Wilner, he said, why would we leave a conference where we have to compete with only 10 members as one of 10 members for a college football playoff berth? Why would we leave to go to one that, where we have to compete against 16 teams right. to get an automatic bid? And so I think that expansion of the playoff, we all know, was a little bit of the presidents and chancellors nationally going, hold on, we don't quite like where this is all going. And so I think they added some stability to the marketplace by doing that. But I see Colorado as a Pac-12 member, Arizona State, Pac-12, Utah's locked in. I think they're all locked in. And I think for that reason, I think they will be Pac-12 members in this next cycle. I do expect that the media rights deal will be something that expires like in 2029 or so. I think the Pac-12 will members are going to want to have that expiration in front of the Big Ten, in front of the SEC. They'll want to go back to market again before the others. That's something to keep an eye on.
And hopefully they'll learn from I don't know if I'd say mistakes, but hopefully they'll learn from this time around.
Yeah, they made mistakes. No, clearly they have made mistakes.
Right.
Like, we can nitpick them to death, but
yeah. But yeah, I think also another point I want to touch on quickly too is the Big 12 doesn't have a brand that is like equates to any of the, or not, I won't say any of the remaining Pac-12 teams, but the Pac-12 has bigger brands than the Big 12. And so I think people will kind of forget that just because the Big 12 is flashier and they're definitely more vocal about what they're doing, they aren't a bigger brand, if you will, in terms of like, we have Oregon, there's Washington, Colorado in the Pac-12 is much more relevant now than they ever were in the Big 12. And so I think people kind of forget that too. Last thing I want to talk about with you, John, and before we go, there's a new presence in the Pac-12. He resides in Colorado now, Coach Prime. I wanted to get your perspective on just how he's maybe changed Colorado for the better and how he's kind of changed the conference for the better.
Yeah, to that point, like it's interesting because you live it, you breathe it, you see Coach Prime, you're in it, like the hysteria and the emotion, the spring game, all the tickets. I am a big fan of this hire. I think Rick George made a home run grand slam hire by getting Deion Sanders, Coach Prime to Colorado. But it's interesting to me that the coaches around the conference are talking about it, right? That we've talked more about Colorado football in my radio show in Oregon in the last 6 months than in the previous 16 years. Like it has become something that people are talking about. The coaches are all amongst themselves talking about how they think Colorado will be. What will they do in year one? How many games will they win? Will the enthusiasm equate to actual victories on the field? Like those are questions. So I think it's a brand new place for a program that has not been very competitive in recent years in football. It's exciting. This is good for the Pac-12. It's fun for the rest of us to kind of watch what's happening. I'm enjoying Coach Prime on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and watching him talk to the kids on the team. I like a lot of the messaging that he gives kids. Like I find myself repeating that stuff and, in our own household with my 3 daughters. I love the attention to detail, the process orientation stuff that he does. I think it's all fantastic. I think it's a home run hire. And so the question now becomes, okay, how many games do they win in year one? The schedule's brutal. We've seen it. And the Pac-12, Pac-12 wanted eyeballs early on, stuck those games against Oregon and USC at the beginning of the conference schedule. It's going to be a tough 5-game start for Coach Prime in Colorado. But let's see what happens. I mean, in a lot of ways, look back at Oregon State and Jonathan Smith, right? That's where you want to get. You want to get to thinking and talking about playing for a conference championship. Well, year one for Jonathan Smith, it was like 2 wins. And it was, hey, they're a little more competitive. And then year 2, hey, they're actually winning some of these games. And then year 3, they are winning these games. And so there is a progression here. I think it's going to be a struggle to get bowl eligible in year 1. And I don't mean that as a slap, but I just think that's how depleted the roster was. But I think it's going to be one of the obvious spotlights every week in the Pac-12. And I don't care if they're winning or losing games. I think people are going to be talking about Colorado, and that's good for Colorado, and it's good for the Pac-12.
Yeah, I think before we go, Coach Prime is as accessible of a college coach as we've ever seen. I don't think I've ever seen a coach on TikTok willingly. I think we see these social media posts with coaches, and it's like you could tell that it's very scripted, and you could tell that they were kind of asked to do it. Whereas Coach Prime, I think he embraces it. He's the modern college football coach, and it's exciting to see what he will do at Colorado. John, I want to thank you for coming on to the show. I know you got to get going. You guys can follow John on Twitter. I have his Twitter below his name. Check out his podcast with John Wilner. They're always talking about Pac-12 things. They got the latest on everything we talked about. That it'll change by tomorrow, I'm sure. But John, I appreciate you coming on.
You bet. I appreciate you guys. Take care.
Have a great time. Bye.